Hi, and welcome to Deep Leadership. I'm your host, John Rennie. In today's episode, we're tackling a leadership blind spot that could cripple your business: disaster preparedness. My guest, Patrick Hardy, is a top expert in crisis response and the author of Design Any Disaster. He's here to show you why most leaders fail in a crisis and how you can break the chain before disaster strikes. Now, if you think you're ready for the unexpected, think again. Welcome to the Deep Leadership Podcast. Today I'm joined by Patrick Hardy. Patrick is an expert in disaster preparedness and response. He is a graduate of FEMA's Advanced Academy with certifications as a Master of Exercise, Certified Emergency Manager, Certified Risk Manager, and Master Business Continuity Professional. Drawing from his wealth of experience, Patrick equips leaders with practical strategies to break the crisis creation chain and teaches them to eliminate disasters by turning disruptions into opportunities. He is the author of Design Any Disaster, the revolutionary blueprint to master your next crisis or emergency. And I'm excited to have him on the show to learn more from his expertise. So, Patrick, welcome to the show.
John, thank you very much for having me.
It's great to meet you. You know, in all the 240 episodes or so, we've never talked about disaster preparedness and disaster recovery and response. So I'm glad to have you here. Glad to have your expertise here to talk to our leaders today. But tell us a little bit about your journey. Now, how did you end up becoming an expert in disaster preparedness and response? I imagine that's not something you go to school originally and you grow up as a kid wanting to do. How did you end up in this field?
Well, it all started when I joined the swim team. That's how I tell people how it all started. So I was a swimmer, and no one liked to do the long distance like I used to do. So I used to do the 500 and the mile, and I was never a great. I mean, I liked swimming, but I was never competitively good. I'm a sort of a lowly 5'10". That at the time I was probably 5'6" or 7, not exactly Olympic size, but nevertheless, I used to do the long. I used to do the long swims. And at the end of the season, a bunch of them said, "Hey, listen, we're all going to go out for lifeguard training." And I said, "Why not?" So I went and because I was so used to doing long distance, I was actually ended up beating a lot of those other guys because they weren't used to anything more than 50s or 100s or 200s at the most. And you had to swim essentially a mile and a half. So it was a really long swim. And then from there, a lot of guys said, I want to become an EMT. And then a lot of so I became an EMT. And then a lot of guys said, I want to become a medic. So I became a medic. And then at the same time, I was going to college. And like I was telling you before we started recording here, I was studying international political science. And so I thought to myself, I really want to find something that's for me. Everybody, if you study political science, everybody has a cause that they like. They're trying to, eliminate nuclear weapons, or they're trying to, create world peace, or they're trying to, eliminate famine, whatever. And I didn't have that. So right after I graduated, the August after I graduated, we had Hurricane Katrina. And I wrote a letter to the governor of Louisiana, and I said, listen, I'm a nobody. I'm a nobody. I have no political connections. I don't know anything. But this seems like an important enough geopolitical topic that I want to make a contribution to. So I would love to come work for you. So, and I didn't think I would hear anything back. Anyway, a staffer called me 2 days later and said, the governor's never received a letter like this before. So
Hmm.
here's the deal. We'll have you come to Louisiana. We'll pay you a whopping $1,500 a month. We'll give you a car, a place to live, and food. And basically, you can do all the disaster trainings that you want. In return, you agree to work 100 hours a week. So what do you think? And I said, I'm on the next plane. And so, John, I got on the next plane. I went to Louisiana, and that's how it all started. I just thought this is such a seminal time in the history of this discipline that I have to be here for this because it's going to change. And I was right. Everything changed after Hurricane Katrina, and
That's
I
right.
was right there, and I was so happy because it laid the groundwork for an unbelievable career that I've had so far. So
That's
that's how it
crazy.
started.
And truth of the matter is, and that did change a lot of things because of, the extent of that disaster and because of so many things that came out of, the response, and it really took out a sitting president essentially, just because of that the public concern about the response and what have you. So it's really incredible that you were there on the ground at that moment, because that was such an important part of of the history of disaster preparedness and recovery and response. So it's incredible. Now, so tell us a little bit about so we have a leadership podcast. We're dealing with a lot of different business leaders, different organizations, nonprofits, profitable companies. We have fire, we have police that are listening in, a lot of military veterans. What do leaders need to understand about disaster preparedness?
What they need to understand is you can't do it by yourself. One of the things that happens, this is one of the universal mistakes that I have seen done in the public sector, in the private sector. I've worked with small businesses of all kinds. I've worked with restaurants, bars, nursing homes. I work with, believe it or not, John, an alligator farm in Georgia. And I work with a hair salon. Don't ask me how I got that client. It's for another story, for another podcast on another day. A hair salon in Zimbabwe, of all places. So anyway, I've worked with lots of different companies, and they all make the same mistake. They all codify either in their disaster plans or in their procedures or in their policies or in the way they operate. They solidify the following assumption: if I do nothing, someone else will handle it for me. And that's because a lot of times leaders, particularly people who are so used to taking charge, which is very obvious, right? If you're in the armed forces, particularly if you're an officer, I mean, you're trained to be able to lead groups of people. And in first response, it's the same way. You're used to taking charge. But what ends up happening is you disenfranchise a lot of folks because they then think, that's okay. I don't have to do any planning because the firemen, the police officers, the EMS people, emergency management, fill in the blanks, they'll handle it for me. So therefore, they don't get prepared. And so what happens is that leaders then get put into a much more difficult position because they have solidified this assumption. John, I can't tell you the number of disaster plans I have opened, and they say the same thing. Step one, stay calm. It's silly, but that's what it always says. And then after that, it says contact your manager or contact the supervisor, right?
Yeah.
Or contact so-and-so, as if you're like a third grader and you can't handle it by yourself. You've got to have someone else doing it for you. And so as a result, I see companies with very talented people who simply don't do anything because they think in themselves, I know the disaster plan, I'll handle it. And business leaders will say, don't learn the disaster plan, don't work on it. When I train people, I work to break that assumption. And what I literally will turn to employees will do, I've done this many times, John. I'll go to a drill at a company and the managers will be all spiffy and ready to go and everyone's ready to go. And I'll say, first things first, none of the managers may participate for the first 30 minutes. Zero, no one. Here's the second thing I do. I say, who's here is the newest at the company? Who's new? Who really is like, doesn't know this place very well and really is unsure of themselves. And there's always someone in the back who's like trying to sort of avoid my gaze.
Yes.
And I pick that person and I say, see this big, thick disaster plan? This is now yours. You are going to run this for the first half hour. And everybody gets nervous. And I say, if the disaster plan can't work for the person who's a line employee, how can we expect it to learn anyone else? So what I say is, instead of assuming if I do nothing, someone will handle it, I force people to say, if I do nothing, no one else will either. That is the better assumption, and that prevents that error from being made.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think of my training in the Navy. So you couldn't call 911 if we had a fire. So, or any disaster. So we were taught to run towards the fire, right? And so we had a process, and I was the machinery division officer, and my responsibility was to be the first person at the scene and take charge, right? And so you inevitably would end up at a scene. There would be a petty, different, levels of petty officers, and I would say, this is Lieutenant Rennie, I'm in charge. And so I would take charge and I would take charge and contain until the XO showed up to relieve me. So in other words, we had a process by which everybody knew what to do, where to go. And so I knew my role whenever it was flooding, fire, whatever, I was running
Sure.
towards it as quick as I could to take charge because I knew that was my role. But we practiced and trained over and over again because we couldn't call 911. But what I see in business is that, well, we can't think of every eventuality or every problem that could occur, but we've always got 911. We can always call the experts, right? And you're saying there's more to it than that.
Yeah, because you understand this very well. The first minutes of an emergency are sometimes the most important.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I see employees standing around like lemmings who don't know what they're doing because they say so and so isn't here, and I'll say, "Why isn't anyone doing anything?"
Mm-hmm.
No, I'll say, well, so and so is gone. We called her. We're waiting for her to show up. I was like, why are we waiting for her to show up? We have a tornado watch, and then they turn into a tornado warning. We need to get people downstairs, whatever. I mean, in hurricanes, this happens all the time because hurricanes happen in the summertime, right? And sometimes in the last few years, regardless of whatever the causational factors are for that, they're occurring earlier and earlier and earlier. So sometimes it's catching company leadership off guard, even in places like Florida where they get disasters cyclically, right? They'll get a hurricane almost every year. And what'll happen is that they'll say, so and so was on vacation. And so they're waiting for them to come back because hurricane's still 3 days out, right? So they're waiting. And so I said, why are we wasting 24 hours?
Mm-hmm.
Why are we wasting 48 hours waiting for that person to occur? We need you to be the XO. We need you to be that person to come on scene. I need you to be the person to come on scene and say, I'm the LT, I'm going to be in charge. And in fact, what I do at companies is I actually tell them, I actually will turn to somebody and I'll say, who are you? And they'll say, oh, and so I'm so and so. And I say, no, don't tell me your job title. I
Mm-hmm.
don't want to know what your job title is. I don't care what your job title is. I'm not interested in that. All I care about is, can you activate the disaster plan? Can you conduct its steps? Can you act within policy? Because that's why we write them. Because if it was always, the CEO does everything, then why do we even have disaster plans? The CEO is
Yeah.
going to do everything anyways. And this happens also in recovery. During COVID, can't tell you the number of workers who were telling us afterwards. I'd give presentations in the years afterward, and they would say, no one ever told us what was going on. They would
Mm-hmm.
just say, office is closed, not when are going to reopen. Are my benefits going to be impacted? Am I still going to get paid? Is the company even in business? And those are critical errors that management makes all the time because they just decide, I'm going to be in charge. I'm handling everything, and that sounds good in theory. It makes great Hollywood because The Rock is an awesome protagonist. He can always pull people out of any situation, but in real life, we have to act on those things by ourselves. And when we disenfranchise people, that demonstrates a failure of leadership because then you have people around who are otherwise really productive are doing nothing.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I know, during COVID, I run my own manufacturing business. I started 9 years ago and we had to survive. We went through the whole thing. But I think one of the things that leaders kind of forget is they can say the words, I don't know. Like I don't know. I'm going to be looking into it. But I think people were used to having the answer for everything. And then in the case of COVID, we didn't know, right? And so I think being transparent with that is a lot of leaders struggled with transparency. They would just clam up and say nothing, right? And so then nobody knew what was going on, and that's not a good thing as well. So I mentioned in the introduction the idea of a crisis creation chain. I've never heard that terminology before, so I thought I'm sure my listeners haven't heard it either. So what is that? What is that, and how does it relate to disasters?
John, disasters don't just happen. They're a chain of critical events. Disasters don't just randomly appear out of nowhere. There's a series of causational actions that occur that lead up to that disaster, and inevitably, they're human caused. I do this with audiences. I'll always say to people, okay, guys, first thing I want to know is what do you think is a disaster? And people will say, it's a tsunami, it's
Hmm.
a category 5 hurricane, it's a tornado. And I say, well, what if it's the year 65, well, what if it was like 665 million years ago and there's a hurricane? Is that a disaster? They always go when they have to think about it. They're like, well, there were clearly no human beings at that time, and I'll say, well, so essentially the disaster occurs then when a natural hazard, like a hurricane, like a tornado, like a tsunami, intersects with human organization,
Hmm.
then it impacts the ability of the human organization to continue to function right, right? And so what I say is that in most disasters, we're now at a place where we have management technology, so we have emergency preparedness. That's why they have people like me, because we know enough on how to prepare. And one of the things that I have discovered studying disasters all over, even 100 years ago, there are causational factors that will lead to cascading effects. That is the crisis chain, and the chain gets longer and longer and longer. The more that we allow it to occur, we don't break the chain anywhere in between. And so that's why I say to people, if we are able to do things like emergency planning, training, drills, we can figure out how to break that chain so much earlier. And that puts us in a better position as leaders to be able to respond to these things and to recover afterward.
That makes a lot of sense. It really does. Well, you mentioned that a lot of leaders make errors when a disaster actually hits. So when the disaster hits, and what's sort of the some of the biggest mistakes that leaders make when something bad does happen? Is it the like you were saying earlier, where they want to handle all the issues themselves, or is it that they say that they say everybody just remain calm, or what are some of the big mistakes that leaders make?
That they increase that chain. That's what
Hmm.
happens. And so what
Okay.
happens is, and they codify the chain so it's harder to break. So
Okay.
they'll do things like this. They'll run an office and they'll put all the emergency supplies in a room because they don't want it to get stolen, whatever. And then they'll lock the door, and then they'll be the only one with the key,
Yes,
right?
I see
And
this
they do
happening. Yeah,
that,
yeah.
right? Exactly, because that's an embodiment of that philosophy of that's okay. Don't do anything. I will handle it for you. I will go and be the hero for you. I will get the equipment out. Same with emergency plans. I'll work with companies where they are satellite offices. And they'll say, okay, I don't want you calling the main office. I will call the main office for you. So now you have hours go by and events are occurring, and central management has no idea what's going on here.
Hmm.
All because we codified that into place. So, technology too. People won't have passwords. I've actually seen it where technology and brick and mortar problems have met, where we literally couldn't get into the server room, so someone took an axe and smashed the handle of the door off. So they walked inside, the IT guy who was the local IT person, and he didn't have the password to access the whatever the cloud was. And he said, I can't activate this response plan,
Hmm.
even though they were in the middle of a cyber attack, because they had no way of accessing it. He said, I have localized access. That I do, but anything more than that, I don't. And so that's what happens when management says, I don't want you doing anything.
Hmm.
Another example, I see this happens constantly, and it's something that we really need to think about as really elastic leaders and as resilient leaders, is when we are working with our employees and dealing with the media. When I see leaders who go to their employees and say, if the media says something to you, tell them no comment.
Hmm.
That's like the worst possible thing. I know it sounds great in theory, and in Hollywood it sounds fantastic, but in the real world it sounds awful. And we live in a world now where you have everyone's a photojournalist. Why? Because everyone's got one of these, right? So and so what happens is that management will be doing things behind the scenes, and they won't empower their employees. So what I always say to companies is this: you guys are sort of getting some free emergency crisis communication advice today. Is go to your employees and say, hey, listen, if you run into a member of the media, don't scream no comment, don't say don't talk to me or anything along those lines. Say, I would love to answer that question, but the better person to speak to is Jane Doe. Her phone number is 555-1212. She will be happy to speak with you at any time. You see how that instantly neutralizes the situation instead of saying no comment. and covering
Yeah.
up. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Where people, because then that's a failure in leadership, right? We look foolish.
Right.
So that's the reason why I say to folks is work with your employees so that they're part of the solution. They're not lemmings where you're telling them, do this, do that, do this. If you do nothing, I'll do it for you. That is a recipe for great disasters.
It almost sounds like great leadership, which is the idea that we have to delegate, tasks down to our organization. So we have to trust people, we have to empower them, we have to give them roles that are, and not put everything in the hands of just one person, especially in a disaster where that person may have been a casualty to the event, right? And then suddenly you have no response. So the idea of what I'm hearing is the idea of a disaster plan that's more effective is that more people are involved. There's been delegated down, and there's multiple people have roles. They understand their roles and responsibility. There's backup, there's backup to the backup, so that you don't end up having a single point failure. As you mentioned, that chain just keeps going, right? And so you need to be able to break it. And if you just have everything single point failure, then you're going to fail, right? I mean, that's one of the things we learned in
Yeah,
the submarine was like there was redundancy in everything that we did. In case one thing failed, we always
exactly.
had the backup plan. We always had a backup plan. And so it was only when both your primary and your backup plan fails when you're real trouble.
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. And I'll tell you, John, the way that I handle it is this, is that, and for those of you who hear this, here's a recommendation for you. When you are writing your emergency plans, if your company says we got to have an emergency plan, if you're that large and you say we've got to have one, great, fantastic. Involve the employees. They need to
Mm.
be part of it. I do this all the time. I got hired by a massive nursing home. This is very early in my career. And I walked in the room. I was going to be training people. And I didn't even have the plan done yet. And I went to them and I said, I'm not the expert here. You guys are. You guys know this place. You know how this place works. You are here 24 hours a day. Some of you work first shift. So, in other words, they're working from morning to lunchtime, and some of you are the mid shift, and some of you are working the graveyard shift, and you're working with, and there's like 500 people in here who can't do anything for themselves. You're it. And so you have people who have dementia, and there's memory care units, and there's the assisted living side, and there's independent living, and all that. And you're juggling all that. And when employees simply don't have any way or any way of doing anything about it, they just get really paralyzed. So what I say to folks is I say, involve them in the disaster plan so that they're familiar with it. If they're familiar with it, they contributed to it, they will use it.
Mm.
If you don't, and you come down like Moses off the mount and you say, here's the 2 stone tablets, do whatever it says, but you know what I mean? People are going to immediately say, why should I? I'm not going to read this document. I mean, no one's going to ever, other than me, no one ever reads disaster plans. So they're not going to care. They're not going to be involved. And so one of the things I emphasize, and I love hearing what you said about the culture on the sub, because that's really what it is. It's a culture of we're all in this metal tube surrounded by ocean that at any time, for those of you who recall the Titan disaster, which just occurred, right? I mean, the ocean can take you like that, right? So we have to work together. We're on an island in essence. And that's really what I tell businesses. You're on an island. If other people help you, great. But in the end, it's up to you. You're the one that has to do these things. And so when I talk to management, I say, if you're going to create this beautiful disaster plan, pay me money to do this, I should involve the employees. And so I used to do that. I used to say, hey, we're planning on doing this. We're planning on evacuating here and doing this. What do you guys think? And I totally forgot this. I'm kind of embarrassed to even say the story, but I was a young EM, so I was sort of new at doing this. And I was saying, all right, so if we have to evacuate, we got to go here and here. And they were just like staring at me and they go, you understand this is Minnesota, right? You understand this is January. We can't move people outdoors in northern Minnesota in January. We can't. And so I literally wrote the plan thinking I forgot that it really has to be seasonal, right? So
Yeah.
so in disasters, if we have a situation we have to evacuate, we have to have a place we got to take people because we can't leave anybody outside, right? So those are the kinds of things that when I talk now about evacuating, engaging people engages the culture, engages people, and that helps to break that chain very easily because now you have not one person staring at the chain, you have 50 people, 500 people staring at that chain, to ensure that it doesn't turn into a disaster.
What's interesting is it almost is similar to a strategy document, because I see some companies will develop a fancy strategy document, right? And it'll be really good, it'll be thick, it'll be in a 3-inch binder, and then ends up on a shelf and nobody ever looks at it. But then there's leaders that then take the strategy and then it's a living document, and so the people understand, they understand the roles in it, they talk about it every day, so it's a living document. It's something that's not on a shelf, it's actually part of the culture. And it sounds like, creating your disaster plan and then, maybe having regular run throughs of that disaster plan is more like a living document. It needs to be something that everybody understands. So they're part of it when it's created. And they're also part of it when you're doing your regular tabletop exercises, you're doing regular, drills and what have you, so that it's not just isolated to one person on a shelf, and it's not, and no one's ever looking at it. Right. It sounds a little similar to that.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that a lot of senior managers have to understand, because there's still a fair number of Gen Xers who are still in basically what I would call C-suite style positions. They're
Yeah.
CEOs, they're owners, they're presidents, and then you have and also you get also some older. I'm starting to see more older millennials, so people who were born around 1981, 82. They're starting to get into those positions, senior level management positions. But I tell them, I say, you understand that Gen Zers, people who are born essentially after 2000 or so, they expect to have participation, whether we like that or not. They want to have participation, otherwise they are not engaged in it. These are people who have never seen a world without Facebook.
Yeah.
These are people who have never lived in a world without YouTube. Okay. So these people expect to be able to engage with you. If you shut them out and you hand them a big document and say, you just do what I tell you, you understand this very well. People will shut down, and they're starting. And now, so I'm starting to see a lot of Gen Zers begin to come out of college. And managers are getting some friction and fight back because they're not used to saying that. They're used to just saying, hey, listen, this is what management tells us to do. And you simply can't be like that. Gen Alphas are a little too young to be in the workforce, but in the next 10, 15 years, they'll be in junior management positions, and you're going to see the Gen Zers all of a sudden, the middle managers. And so that transition will be complete. And so one of the things I say to managers, I say, if you want your company culture to endure, you need to engage in a collaborative process. And that's not easy to do because I know sometimes first responders are very used to top-down leadership. And I say my approach to disaster preparedness is very different than others, because when you're writing a disaster plan for a hair salon in Zimbabwe, everyone has to have a participatory role. There's no one person in charge. There's a series of people that, because I'll never visit there, or at least not, I won't be able to visit anytime soon. And so I say to them, we have to engage you so that every employee is involved. At nursing homes, they do it all the time. I'll take, assistant maintenance officers, and I'll say, I know that you're just the maintenance guy, quote unquote, but I'm going to put you in charge, or I'm going to give you a role. And you know what ends up happening? Something fascinating occurs. We will run a drill. I will have them involved. And at the end of it, they will turn to me and say, I need to tell you something. And I can't say this to management, but I want to tell you. And I say, what? He goes, we would never do this. We would never do this. And we would never do this. Who told you that? And I said, well, the COO told me. He goes, that's not the way it works at this facility at 3 a.m. That's not how this works.
Yeah.
You have to modify it. That's what I try to. And that's why a lot of times, especially if you're with a big business, you should hire outside people, because outside consultants, I'm non-threatening, right? Because I'm wearing, a blue polo shirt that's not, company colors, and I'm just coming in and doing that stuff. And I create a welcoming environment. And I find that people will be so much more effective when they can feel free to say what they want to. And that's really important part of the disaster planning process and the recovery process as well.
That makes a lot of sense. I've worked for, big companies for 22 years. I ran 8 different manufacturing locations. So I've kind of used to this, having this process in place. But now, last 9 years, I've been running my own manufacturing company. It's independent. I'm the CEO. I run it. I own it. It's different. It's smaller. So and I know we have a lot of entrepreneurs that listen into, maybe small business leaders. what should small business leaders be thinking about? Maybe they don't have the resources of the big companies. Maybe they don't have large teams. What should they take away from this idea of emergency preparedness?
It's even more important for you because you have fewer people. So if you only have, instead of having 400 employees, you have 4 employees. Great. Now you have a smaller team. Now it is more important, not less. It's more important that we engage every single person. So if you're an entrepreneur and if you're one of those ambitious entrepreneurs, there are those in America who knew, right? And you want to eventually build a big company. I have done this. I have worked with Silicon Valley startups. I have worked with a lot of them, not one or two. I've worked with many of them. These are young people who are mid 20s, sometimes late 20s, sometimes early 30s, who have never been in charge. I mean, they've been middle managers, or maybe they were just students, or they had this great idea, or they worked in other tech companies, and now they were engineers, had this great idea. What I tell them is immediately set up a culture that's participatory in the disaster planning process. Don't just hand it to a consultant and say, get it done, have it done in 6 months. By now, that doesn't work, right? So if you're a small business and you got 4 people, whether you want to grow big or you like being 4 people or whatever, you need to involve all of them and say, if something happens to this business, this is how we will respond. This is how we're going to recover. Here's how we're going to be more resilient afterwards. So those are the things I tell, particularly for small businesses, because I work with really small ones and I say, listen, if the boss isn't here, and this actually will happen, you'll have an earthquake, something will happen to the owner, they'll get hit in the head, they become a casualty, and then the employees are just like, I don't know what to do. And
Hmm.
I'll say, if something happens to you, they're your succession plan. This is your business. So make sure that you have people around you that can take over if you aren't there. And one other thing I'm going to say is, as kind of a basic addendum to that, is because sometimes I'll hear entrepreneurs say, well, I don't want them doing it.
Hmm.
And I'll say, well, then why did you hire these people? What were you doing hiring them? You don't
Yeah.
trust these people. Then what are they doing working for you then? You know what I mean? Just tell them take a hike and get people who you care about. But usually it's a culture issue. If you establish it early, you can maintain it throughout.
Yeah, that's great. Such good advice. I know we're in North Carolina. We're about to get hit with 8 to 10 inches of snow tomorrow, and we've already
Mm.
huddled and we know exactly what we're doing over the next 2 days to deal with it, and is done in a participatory manner. Like we know something's coming, so we've got we batten down the hatches. We got a plan for the next 2 days, but I think it's because everybody's been involved, right? So it's not just me. It's my entire team that's ready for this, and I think that's a great piece of advice. Is that we need we always say with entrepreneurs, if you want to grow, you need to let go. But it's the same thing. If you want to be prepared, you also have to let go and you got to let other people be involved as well. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Patrick, this has been a phenomenal discussion. What final message would you like to leave with our listeners today?
Whenever I do anything, whether I'm delivering a presentation, I'm delivering a keynote, or I'm doing a YouTube video or whatever, I end with the same thing. I always say, prepare for disasters and you'll never experience one. And I mean it. You don't have to experience a disaster. But it's about appropriate kinds of preparation. And disaster plans are not appropriate for every organization. There's a way of doing it. Today, we don't have the time to talk about it, but there's methods. But the whole point is, I say, I don't care whether you're using plans, equipment, supplies, technology, whatever it is. In the end, it is about adequate preparation and empowering people around you. Disaster planning doesn't have to be doom and gloom. It doesn't have to be blood and guts. It doesn't have to be Chicken Little. If we prepare ourselves and put ourselves in a place where we are successful, our employees are successful, and we position our resources appropriately, we will do enough preparation where it can be like that hurricane 65 million years ago. It's just a hurricane. That's it. But when we break that chain early enough, we're preparing enough for disasters that we will never, ever experience one.
Wow, that's fantastic advice. That is just exactly what we need to hear on this show. Patrick, thanks for coming on and sharing this information because I know it's gotten me thinking about other areas like that. I think like I've got things handled, but now I'm thinking about a few things I probably need to spend some time thinking about. So thank you for bringing this awareness to all of us that are listening in. How can the listeners find out more about you, your book called Design Any Disaster, and your work, the work you do?
Yeah, and here's the book right here behind me. And of course, you can find it on Amazon. But where you can really find out a lot about me is disasterpatrick.com. Again, disasterpatrick.com. I deliver keynote presentations. I become podcast guests, kind of like I am here. And, I travel. I do great YouTube videos. We're doing some amazing things. So I'm taking on the most difficult disaster challenges in the world, and I'm going to be showing people on YouTube how to get past them. So I'm really, really excited. I'd love to collaborate with any of you. I'm still a consultant, obviously. I do trainings, I do one-on-ones, I do coaching. So it's a lot of fun for me because I'm at a point in my career now where I can come back and speak to people about all the things that I have learned in emergency preparedness. So again, disasterpatrick.com. And thank you for having me, John. I was glad to be the first one to come on and talk to you about crises and emergencies and disasters and things because it's a lot of fun for me. It's a great passion and something I really enjoy. So it was an honor being here today, and I appreciate the chance to be able to be in conversation with you.
Fantastic. And it's been an honor to have you on the show. We've learned a lot. And again, listeners, if something in Patrick's conversation really struck something with you like it did me, please reach out to him. We have links in the show notes below, and you get all of Patrick's resources, including his book, Design Any Disaster. And I highly encourage you to take a look at that. And if you haven't planned for your, getting ready for emergency preparedness, I highly encourage that you do and use Patrick as a resource to get that done. It's very important. So, Patrick, I want to thank you for coming on the show. Thank you for sharing your expertise with our listeners today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that is it for today. Thank you for listening to Deep Leadership. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and share so we can continue to build a world with better bosses. Until next time, this is John Rennie saying take care and lead well.